Hi, hi everybody. So we have Arpad Szoczi. I don't know if I got your name right.
Almost, Szoczi.
Oh well, it's a big difference. And we're going to talk about the Romanian Revolution, about your book and your movie. But first of all, please just who is Arpad?
I was born in Canada, so I'm a Canadian citizen. I'm also a Hungarian citizen because my father was from Hungary. My mother was from Austria, and I was born and raised in Toronto. There were a few years in Winnipeg, but most of my life while I was in Canada was in Toronto. And my grandmother came from Transylvania. So I knew about Romania to a certain degree. My father had spent his summers there after the borders had changed, visiting his relatives and in the 20s and 30s. So he told me about the situation a little bit. And there was a very active Hungarian colony and there still is in Toronto. At the time, it was very big compared to the Romanian community. Let's say, for example, in the 1980s, there were about 30,000 people of Hungarian origin or directly from Hungary living in Toronto. And there were only about 3,000 Romanians. Now that has drastically changed now.
Absolutely. Now we're
then in Toronto, then the Hungarians in Toronto,
exactly.
or generally, because of the unfortunate depopulation going on in Romania. Yeah. But in any case, so I grew up there and I knew about it, and I was sensitized to the situation of the people suffering under Ceausescu, all the people. And we weren't just focused on the Hungarian minority, but they had a double pressure on them. Not only were they subjugated, as every Romanian citizen was, and they were possible victims of the Securitate, but they also were victims of discriminatory policies, where Ceausescu had this plan, this dream to eradicate minority cultures, which he always denied. But I mean, you could see it from schools being closed, etc. And in any case, I just thought that's kind of unjust. I thought the whole situation in Eastern Europe was unjust, and I couldn't understand why communism was still surviving. But we realized from Poland that things were changing, that they were brave, and that they were giving a wonderful example of how to stand up. And what the Hungarians did in Hungary, those who were brave enough to stand up, they went to Poland. They got printing presses sent to them illegally, clandestinely. And they got information and help on how to set up samizdat publications. And we were observing all of this. And then I met somebody in New York City called Laszlo Hamos. And it's complicated how I got in touch with him, but in any case, I had told him that was 1984 December, and I told him, guess what? In 1985 May, the next year, there's going to be the World Human Rights Conference, and I know that Romania will be there. And so I said, why don't we do a demonstration? And he agreed, and it was huge, and it was successful. And the Romanian ambassador was extremely upset, so upset that he showed up at the Ottawa police chief's door a week before the demonstration. And the Ottawa police chief called me asking me to cancel the demonstration because his first sentence to me was, have you ever seen a grown man cry? And I said, what are you talking about? And he told me the ambassador fell apart in front of him, begged him not to let the demonstration take place because we are terrorists. And I laughed and laughed. I said, well, look, he's right on one point. The demonstration will take place and we are not terrorists. And that's how that started. And then finally, we sometimes held vigils. Sometimes we had an underground news network, and it was run by Geza Szoczi, and well, actually, it was run by another colleague of mine. He had been kicked out of Romania along with Geza Szoczi because they had run the only clandestine samizdat publication in Romania called Ellenpontok, or counterpoints, or contrapuncte in Romanian. And it was the only samizdat publication at the time distributed profusely, and they got caught. They got caught in 1983, towards the end of 1983, and the 4 members were all kicked out. And so they started producing it out of Budapest with minor success. And but they had established an underground news network, and we were getting stuff out from Romania regularly, and we knew what was going on. And it was about, I would say, 95% accurate. There were some inaccuracies, for example, but basically, if I look back on it, it was pretty well right on. And I had contacted a gentleman at Southern Press in Ottawa and told him about it. And I said, you want some hot information? And he said, give me a few examples. His name is Jonathan Manthorpe. And he phoned me a week later and he says, everything you sent me is correct. I want to come down to one of your meetings. So he came down to our meetings, which we held at the Hungarian Cultural Center, which at the time was on St. Clair Avenue West. And we established a rapport with him. And through him and through other people, we were starting to feed news organizations like the New York Times.
Did you have any contacts with the Romanian community, the small Romanian community,
Yes.
during your meetings? Did you have any support from the Romanians from Canada?
Yes and no. Well, there was a gentleman called Tudor Bamba, and he was very much anti-communist. I don't think he was very, I'm not quite sure how he stood on the Hungarian minority. I had my doubts, but I could be wrong. And when we finally did demonstrate together, which was in December of 1989 at Queen's Park at the Ontario Legislature, I believe he was there, and he brought Romanians with him. Prior to that, may I say that until 1988, I had never met a Romanian in my life, a Romanian, I mean, there were lots of Transylvanian Hungarians in Toronto. They had been slowly escaping during the 80s. And Hungary wouldn't accept them for a while. They were panic-stricken what to do with these people, so they sent them off to the West. And Western countries, you know, would help along. Canada was one of them. Sweden especially helped. Finland especially helped, etc. Anyway, so until 1988, Romanians for me were people from Mars. I used to ask people, what do they look like? I was so naive. And can you tell them apart on the street? And they said, no. You know, there's so much intermarriage in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe altogether. I've seen blonde Romanians. I've seen blonde Hungarians, redheaded Romanians.
We're nice people too, okay? So
yeah, I know. So and nice people. And so anyway, and finally a woman came to the Hungarian Cultural Center. I'll never forget. It was 1988, the wintertime. And on Sundays we had movies from Hungary, usually the old classical movies from the 30s and 40s, and sometimes newsreels. And she was looking around the lobby, and I said, can I help you? And she goes, well, I heard you show films of Transylvania. I said, yes, we do. We have some films smuggled out, and we show it. I said, may I look at them? And so I brought her in, and I said, where is the Romanian community? And she said, it's horribly splintered. There are three factions. One is a hardline Nazi ideology, the Iron Guard that escaped from the Second World War. Then she told me, then there are those who actually support Ceausescu. And then there's the others who are democratic like she is, so she said. And she says, everyone is panic-stricken about each other, and she did not trust the Romanian priest there. And I don't know, because it was complicated for me. I'm sorry for moving the camera. It was complicated for me. And anyway, so I started meeting Romanians. And we had meetings with the couple, and they said, look, we want to be part of this. We're very small. We're splintered, just like that woman had explained to me. We're worried about whom we can trust. And I said, well, you can trust us. So when we finally did demonstrate towards the end of 89, they came out, but there weren't many, 13, 14.
Do you think in the Romanian community there were agents like sent by Ceausescu's Securitate or the communist regime?
Anything is possible.
Romania?
Anything is possible, but I do know that the Romanian consulate in Toronto and the Hungarian consulate in Toronto.
Yeah, that was my next question, yeah.
They were watching us, and I asked for my file from the Hungarians. I also asked for my file from the Romanians. I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, the Hungarians did give me my file. You can see that a gentleman, I'm assuming from the consulate, not the embassy, but also possibly the embassy. They reported very factually about my father and I, what we're doing. We're planning demonstrations. We are informing reporters and things like that. There was it was very brief, short sentences. There were 5 pages on me, and there were about 30 on my father simply because he had escaped from a communist prison camp in Hungary, and they went into some detail on, but nothing bad about us. As for the Romanians, I went to the Securitate archives in Bucharest. I spent about 35 days there on and off over 2.5 years. And I asked for my file. And I finally got the answer, no file. And I said, what does no file mean? And it says one of two possibilities. Physically, there is no file on you. It just doesn't exist. Or there is a file, but no file for you. In other words, you are a security concern, an ongoing security concern, and you will not get your file. So to this day, I don't know what the situation is.
I've seen in the movie that there was a lot of back and forth from the Hungarian citizens in Canada as well as in Romania. However, in Hungary itself, there was a communist country.
Yeah.
How was that possible? That the communist regime in Hungary did not keep their citizens, safe inside, or how do you explain that?
Well, first of all, until approximately 1988, it was basically illegal to talk about the Treaty of Trianon, to talk about the existence of Hungarian minorities outside of Hungary. It was never taught in school. It was talked within families, and many families, about a third of Hungarian families, have relatives either in Romania or in Slovakia or in Serbia or in Ukraine. I mean, what happened to Hungary is a totally different topic, but that's how the borders changed back in 1920 at the Treaty of Trianon. That's one thing. And then, however, there was an ongoing dissident movement. Viktor Orban, the current prime minister, was part of that. And there were enough Transylvanian Hungarians now in Budapest, living in church basements everywhere, basically begging to have permission to live in the mother country, that an ongoing swell of intellectuals took their cause, and they would not be silenced. And therefore, by approximately February or March of 1988, there was a sea change. And that was just prior to the new prime minister, Miklos Németh, coming on board, who was a Hungarian nationalist, and he would not allow the Hungarian minority in Romania to be suppressed. And he also wanted to get rid of Ceausescu. And not necessarily see him executed, but see a change in leadership. And so in any way, the big change was in March of 1988, where a group of exiled Hungarians in Geneva, Switzerland, started a petition campaign asking for a resolution against Romania and the situation in the country, because of the situation in the country, because of the terrorism caused by the Securitate, and also because of the situation of the minorities, the suppressed minorities. And Sweden agreed to sponsor it, not Hungary. And Hungary was so ashamed by it that after that, and the co-sponsor was Canada, by the way, that after that, Hungary decided to change its policy and openly attacked Romania in international forums. And that was what allowed certain things to be said. And there were reporters reporting on the situation in Romania in Hungarian media, which never, ever occurred before.
The two Canadians' mission, as they called, to get an interview from Laszlo Tökés, was financed by some Hungarian businesses, right? As far as I could understand, from New York City, right?
No, from New York City, from Toronto, and from Montreal.
Okay, but what was it? Because I heard that there was some other parts involved, such as Radio Free Europe or even the Hungarian government. Did they support?
Never got involved until, not that I know of. I mean, there was the trip itself cost 3,000 Canadian dollars. In other words, plane tickets and hotels. And my father and I collected 500 each. That was very simple back then. If you went to an ethnic Hungarian businessman and just said the word Transylvania, they pulled out the checkbook and said, how much do you want? Okay. So there was togetherness at that point. My goodness, there's not that much togetherness now among Hungarians, but back then, Transylvania and Ceausescu was a focal point for Hungarians in the diaspora in North America, for example, and in South America, and in Europe, Western Europe. In any case, so my father and I collected 1,000 altogether. István Tökés in Montreal had 1,000, so that's 2,000. Okay. And then we contacted Hamos, and I had a big argument with him because he didn't want to give the money because he said it's not going to work out. These two reporters speak neither Romanian nor Hungarian. They've never done anything like this before, and we're throwing out money. And I convinced him, I said, even if it doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. It's 3,000, not 300,000. And if it does work out, Ceausescu will be under more pressure again because he's very sensitive to Western criticism. So he finally relented and gave another 1,000, actually a little bit more. So we had that. And then prior to that, Réjean Roy, one of the reporters, did get about $5,000 worth of equipment and accessories, etc., for the trip with cameras and all this other stuff. So if you look at the basic line, it was about 8,500, and the hard cash had to come from us, and we did that. No one else gave us any money.
Okay.
I know, because I was one of the money collectors.
Some Romanian dissidents of Ceausescu regime were arrested and even killed by Securitate because Romanians too, they were not happy, okay, with that regime. However, Laszlo Tőkés was not physically suppressed or attacked. How would you explain that?
Because his brother kept using the media to keep him alive. For example, they contacted Paris Match magazine, and Paris Match did 2 huge cover stories on Laszlo Tőkés, one in the France edition and one in the Quebec edition. And that, plus other reports in Radio Free Europe, we were feeding Radio Free Europe all the time. So you could not get rid of Laszlo Tőkés without making it look like a Securitate hit. So that's why he kept him alive. Plus, after researching at the Hungarian secret police archives in Budapest, in the Octagon area here in downtown Budapest, I was told to keep coming back every few months because they keep getting documents from other sources. And they have a file called Romanian 89. And I would go through the file. It was about my 8th trip, and I stopped dead. And I saw that there was a report by a Hungarian Secret Service agent near Cluj saying that Ceausescu has set up 7 missiles aimed at the Paks nuclear power plant in Hungary. Now, the relationship between Hungary and Romania were horrible at that time in 1989 because of Hungary's open criticism of Romania. And so I realized that no way could a Hungarian secret police agent, secret service agent, get permission to go into Romania, into a so-called friendly socialist neighbor country without permission from the Hungarian prime minister, who at that time was Miklós Németh. So I raced home, I'd copied down the entire report, and I called a reporter in Szeged who had done many interviews with Németh, and I said, I need to talk to him. Németh calls me back 2 hours later, and I told him, look, first of all, I respect very much what you did. I know a whole bunch of things that you made happen in order for the Iron Curtain to fall. And I also saw a document about Romania. Can we speak? He said, tomorrow in a coffee house before they open. So I went there and I showed him the document and I said, is that for real, that a Hungarian Secret Service agent was sent to Romania? And he said, it's for real. I sent 40 agents into Romania. They went everywhere from Bucharest throughout Transylvania to Moldavia, everywhere you can think of. And they built up a telecommunications network within Romania with the sole purpose of being able to listen in on the Securitate talking to each other. And he had a central control operation here in downtown Budapest, underground, where he had native Romanian speakers, or at least speakers who spoke perfect Romanian. I'm assuming a number of them were from the Hungarian minority, and they were working. And he had a control center, and they were able to intercept. And if you remember that helicopter launch when Ceausescu escapes Bucharest,
right,
and they land in Târgoviște, it was the Hungarian Secret Service who heard the pilot saying, we're going to go to Târgoviște, and they told the Romanian military about that. So, I mean, they were very effective. Plus, he had 3 teams protect Laszlo Tőkés, and they were revolving. Now, the Hungarian Secret Service has asked me not to reveal how many people were in each team. They said everything else that I was told by Miklós Németh, I can reveal.
You mean Laszlo Tőkés was protected in Romania during the Ceausescu regime by this Hungarian Secret Service?
In 1989, yes. Teams looked after him, but he didn't know it. I mean, you're a Secret Service. You can't let your presence be known. And they kept relieving each other. I forget now how many times. I think it was either once a week or once every 3 weeks. In other words, there were a number of people in each team, always the same number, and that's what I'm not allowed to talk about. I'm not allowed to tell anyone the exact number of people in the team, but there were, and there were men and women. And so they would watch, and apparently they were very close to him, And I assume that they had also planted eavesdropping devices in his home so that if there was ever a problem, they could be there within seconds. Now, I asked Nemeth if they were armed. He said they were not armed. I questioned that. But in any case,
yeah, of course. But would you say that the Romanian Securitate was a weak instrument? Like, how could they?
Some.
I mean, if you have in your country like such a network, you know, with the secret service from some other countries, like, so that means you don't control your environment in a way, right?
Mm. Well, look, there were a number of problems with the Securitate. First of all, the gentleman, the colonel I interviewed, Radu Tinu, he was very good at his job. He's very dedicated, very talented, very nationalistic, and he adored Ceausescu to this day. And he simply said that Ceausescu got bad advice and didn't see the situation the way he should have seen it, where people were getting more and more frustrated about food shortages, about heating shortages, about not getting medicine in hospital, things like that. So in any case, he also admitted to me that he kicked out one of his Securitate officers for dealing on the black market. And Securitate officers were under pressure. They were supposed to write about 40 pages of reports every month. Well, sometimes there was nothing to write about. They made up stories. And I can tell you, after spending 35 days and many more in Bucharest looking at the files, and at home, when I brought back copies with me, and hundreds of hours looking at them, and I was able to cross-check then with the victims. Did this happen to you? Did that happen to you? And they laughed and laughed, and they said, nothing never happened to me, stuff like that. I never made a deal with this person. I don't even know who this person is. So I would say about 40% of what the Securitate wrote in their reports was nonsense. Some lawyer
I understand.
in Bucharest who defend the Securitate officer said, quote, they were the best fiction writers of all time.
Would you say that the Romanian so-called revolution was a coup d'etat?
Well, I don't think it could have succeeded without outside forces. Now, the Hungarian Secret Service was there to monitor and to protect Turkish. And I asked Gorbachev for an interview because there was an incident where there were many incidents where there were large numbers of Russian tourists in the country at the time, Soviet tourists, I should say, or Russians. And also there was a unit of Soviet citizens who were stopped at the border by Tinu's men, I believe it was. I could be wrong, but I think it was Tinu's men, and at the Yugoslav border. And underneath them, they had Russian military uniforms. So they were forced to turn back and leave, but they came into Romania through another way then. And then finally, there was a very interesting incident where a colleague of mine, his name is Arpad Szoczi, about 2 years after the revolution, he and about 5 other members of the Hungarian minority, they were all working in Hungarian media at the time. They went to the Zakarpatska area of Ukraine, where there are many Hungarians and Romanians in this mixed ethnic region, cities like Munkachevo, Beregovo, Uzhgorod. And they were in one of those cities, I think it was Munkachevo, and where maybe 10% of the population is Hungarian, maybe 10% is Romanian, Ukrainians, Russians, it's all mixed up. And they had gone out for dinner, they come home to their hotel, and there's no reception. And their keys are hanging behind the reception desk. And they wait, and then finally one of them jumps over, grabs the keys, and a man comes out from a side door, says, put the keys back. He's the security guard, and he was watching them. And he decides to invite them up to his room to have some Russian vodka and get hammered. And he's starting to talk, and he says, you'd love to know what I did in Timisoara in 1989 in December. And he said, well, you'll never find out. You'll never find out. Then he goes to the bathroom. So my friend goes to his coat hanging up, looks inside the pocket, takes out his wallet, and there, lo and behold, it's a former KGB card. Puts it back. So I don't have hard proof that the KGB was involved, but I believe it was. And by the way, Gorbachev refused my 2 requests for an interview on this subject.
What was the link between Laszlo Tokes' interview and the so-called Romanian. I don't call it the revolution. I don't like it, but well, let's say so-called the Romanian Revolution. Because in the movie,
Well, first of all, I can tell you that when I was at the Securitate archives in Bucharest, I was called over and by a head researcher, and he said, "Is it true that you were one of the people who raised the money for the TV interview with Laszlo Turkish?" And I said, "Yeah, me and my dad and a few other people." And he goes, "Do you know what an effect that had?" And I said, "Well, I have an inkling about what that meant." And he goes, "You forced their hand." And I said, "Okay, thank you." He didn't go into any more detail, and maybe he regretted talking to me, but it was very interesting. And then basically, I mean, from Tino's reaction, he was furious. And I mean, because of the interview, 2 days later, Laszlo Turkish got a letter from Bishop Pop, and he said, "Because of the interview where you horribly criticized our great leader and our great country, you are fired." And then there was a court case to remove him from the church. He lost the court case, and he was given the deadline of December 15th to leave his home, which was inside the church, or he would be taken out. And on that morning, hundreds and then thousands of people surrounded his church. And it was very interesting because it was very cosmopolitan. First, there were Hungarians, then Romanians. A lot of people didn't even know what was going on, but they heard that there's a demonstration going on. And many of the Romanians didn't know anything about Turkish. Some did. And there were Romanians living in the building who had told their friends and relatives. And so that spread very quickly. And by the next day, it was massive. And that's when Tino told me he got the call to attack. It was 3:00 in the morning on Sunday, December 17th, 1989. And they attacked. And it was in the late evening. And then at 3:00 in the morning, he was told to storm the building and take him out. And Turkish tried to escape, and it didn't work out.
why do you think, like 30 years after the events, like we don't know, we have so many questions about what happened then? Why what's the reason?
I feel sorry for Romania because you don't have the answers. First of all, why execute Ceausescu? He had all the answers. And it is my feeling, and the feeling of many people, is that certain people in Romania, who were also political leaders, did not want certain things to come out. Plus, and it's true, had he been kept alive, there's a good chance that Securitate would try to free him. In other words, the fighting would continue and more people would die. And that was their reasoning. They said, if we don't get rid of him, the fighting will continue. We don't know which way it's going to go, even though the military has switched sides. And he who knows, he might get freed again, and all hell will break loose again. It was bad enough. I mean, officially 1,104 people were killed. It was the only mass murder bloodbath in Eastern Europe during 1989 when the Iron Curtain fell, only in Romania.
What is the secret of the Hungarian lobby? Because I know you guys have a lot of international lobby everywhere. And I would say, yeah, it's pretty well known.
Well, back then.
No, even today, like I think Hungary has a very strong presence everywhere in the U.S. and Canada, and even in Western Europe.
Well, Hungarian cultural centers are supported by the government of Viktor Orban, and they have 2 programs where they send out teachers to keep up the language. In other words, language instruction for 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation Hungarians. I mean, this amazing woman from Uruguay. Her great-grandparents moved to Uruguay in 1930. She speaks perfect Hungarian, lives here in Budapest now, and more kids from Uruguay are coming here to study. And that's just one example. So sure, Hungarians are all over the world. But I slowly see that happening with Romanians too. So many are moving out. There are huge Romanian communities.
Unfortunately, yes.
The Romanian government is helping them. But the Hungarian government has a program called Kőrösi Csoma Sándor, where they help diaspora communities outside of the Carpathian Basin. And they have another program where they help Hungarian communities within the Carpathian Basin. For example, in Sfântu Gheorghe, in Cluj, in Novi Sad, in Serbia, in you name it, all these former areas which used to belong to Hungary, these communities are still being supported. So that is that I guess you could call a lobby, It's mainly to keep up the language and tradition, which is the big thing. Plus, there's you can become a Hungarian citizen fairly easily. And I'm assuming the government, Fidesz government, hopes that you'll vote for them.
Would you know how much money are they involved in these programs, or?
Oh, I would say tens of millions of euros.
Okay.
Tens of, for sure. It's not cheap. It's not cheap.
But it's worth it, I guess.
Look, for me, coming from Toronto, we didn't have that program. We financed everything ourselves at the time, but I know people who are recipients of the program, and they say it's great. They give language instruction for all different levels, for all different age groups. They do Boy Scouting and Girl Guides, Hungarian Boy Scouting and Girl Guide groups. They do expositions, and they do folk dancing. That's the big thing for Hungarians abroad. Nothing brings young people together more than Hungarian folk dancing. I'm not quite sure how Romanian folk dancing is. I've seen a little bit of it. Hungarian folk dancing is much different. If you look at their costumes and everything, it reminds me very much of Kazakhstan. I said, there's got to be a connection between Hungarians and Kazakhstan because, okay, fine, they don't look Oriental, but the Hungarians, but the costumes, the braided costumes, it looks exactly the same. So anyway, so this diaspora is being supported by the Hungarian government, and people are happy about it.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic regarding the future of Eastern Europe? It's a very difficult region, I guess. What would you say?
One more generation. One more generation. In other words, the next generation that retires will be the last one that kind of grew up under communism and kind of followed their ways. Look, I was recently, just a few days ago, in the Czech Republic, and I did notice that the mentality of people of a certain age, 45 and up, was still the old mentality. And I thought that was a shame. And I noticed another problem was not that many people spoke English. Some people tried, and God bless them. But I mean, that's kind of the lingua franca, or German, in Europe right now. And I tried to do business with two places. Because I was an unknown quantity, I saw their surprise and their mistrust. And I thought, in North America, that wouldn't happen. The guy would shake your hand and he says, tell me your story. What do you want to sell? And that would be different. Well, that doesn't exist yet. So you need another generation. Young people are going to be fine. They're going to be fine all over the place. And what I like about Romania is that they're not taking any more shit. There were thousands of people, Romanians from Western Europe and from North America. They flew to Bucharest and they demonstrated against corruption. That was fantastic. And they did it at least 2 times already. And you know what? I hope they'll be back. It's time.
Yeah, even with the Russians' growing influence in the Eastern Europe, like would you say that it's going to still like a democratic region in the future?
The Russian influence is something to consider, something to respect, and be very wary of. Think about history. And if you think about history and you keep that idea alive, you'll be careful. And the best way to deal with any country is to be careful. That's my advice.
Arpad, so thank you very much for your time, and we'll keep in touch.
Sure, anytime.
Thank you.
Okay, see ya. And by the way, this is the book in Romanian.
Of course, we'll publish the link on our.
Okay, the links to me. But anyway, that's fine. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.